Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Sorry for being a little bit tardy. Welcome to Via Media, another conversation. My name is Kevin, and my amazing guest is Austen Hartke, the author of Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians, which is coming out with a new updated and expanded edition, or has already come out.
It has. It came out in March.
Oh, it came out in March. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Austen has a graduate degree in Old Testament and Hebrew Bible from Luther Seminary, founder and executive director of Transmission Ministry Collective, who and has already been extremely active tonight in that ministry and activity, which is why we're a little bit late here. An online community dedicated to the spiritual care, faith formation, and leadership potential of transgender and gender expansive Christians. From 2015 to 2018, Austen created 100 videos for the Transgender and Christian YouTube series, which was an amazing series that I got to watch through, and has published works in Violence Against LGBTQ plus Persons, Research, Practice, and Advocacy by Springer in 2020, Rally, Communal Prayers for Lovers of Jesus and Justice, and Transforming, which we just mentioned here. So, Austen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It is an absolute delight to talk with you this evening. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah.
And running in a little late, but very excited.
Well, that's totally fine. As I mentioned, we're a guilt-free, no pressure kind of a thing. A couple caveats for tonight. I've been traveling for the last 3 weeks, and I feel like I've caught a little bit of a head cold. So for you and for our audience, if I cough or something, I just want to give my apologies up front. I'm starting to feel I have my tea and my sucrets, but that may not do it for our time together. So I apologize for being
Take care of your body.
a little bit under the weather. Number two, I have been wanting to have this conversation for years. I think it was in 2019. I can't remember exactly what year that I saw you at the conference. Now the name's just escaping me.
Was it Evolving Faith?
Yeah, the Evolving Faith Conference. So it was at 2019. So it's been like 4 years.
Yeah.
And so this has been a conversation long time coming, and I've been trying to do my best to gain as much information and read and study and stuff. And this is 4 years late, but Austen, your presentation there was phenomenal in the sense, like right in the line with the ethics and the posture that I wish more people had. You had compassion. You were well-informed and educated the audience. You took the questions with such grace and generosity, because in this particular issue and topic, and I don't even like calling it an issue and topic, but nonetheless, that's kind of the vocabulary that we have. There's so much misinformation. There's so much weaponizing of varieties of different studies and things. And it's just incredibly contentious and vitriolic. And what you did at Evolving Faith was, I thought, just incredibly wonderful and a gift. And I wish more people did what you did, and especially on topics like this. So what I'd like to do tonight, so my second caveat is, I know because of my particular position that I'm going to potentially ask questions that are ignorant and uninformed. And I so appreciate our email exchange where you have helped me correct. And I just want to make sure that I say to you and to the audience that my heart and my spirit is to learn, to grow, to understand better. And you feel like just the perfect person for which to help me do that and to help all of us do that. What I'd like to do in this conversation, if you are game for this, is start at 101, just the absolute basics, talk about religion and sexuality and gender, and then talk about some of the culture wars that many of us are reading about and engaged in and are getting confused by. And the goal of a conversation like this is for all of us to have a better understanding, a more profound sense of compassion to one another, so that we can, advance human thriving and the love of Christ and all of these things that we say we care about. That's my goal. So if you're game for that, Austen, that's where we're going, and I hope the outline that I sent you exemplifies that. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I think It does. I think one of the things that can be really hard in having conversations about well, any sort of identity or experience that is seen as very much embattled, especially in the media, is fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of getting it wrong, and it just stops us from talking about stuff. And so, there need to be times and places where we can talk about things and ask things even when we're afraid. And there are, of course, times to not do that. So it's like, when I step forward and agree to conversations like this, it's a really great thing because it opens up conversation that needs to happen. But it also, I think, is important to recognize that just because one trans person talks about one thing on a podcast doesn't mean that you can go walk up to the trans person on the street and be like, now tell me about this, because they're just out living their lives. So it's important to have this intentional space.
Yeah. Exactly. Last thing, right down below there is the Slido event number 3320699. So those of you who are watching live, you can submit those questions and we'll take those at the end there. Okay, so let's start off with, would you mind sharing just a little bit of your story for those who don't know who you are? Would you mind just sharing a little bit, a brief bit of your story so we can get to know a little bit of the journey that you've been on?
Yeah. Well, the sort of relevant bullet points are that I grew up non-denom evangelical in vineyard churches and EV free churches until sort of around 10 or so years old. And at that point, my dad moved back into the tradition that he had grown up in, which is the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is a more conservative arm of the Lutheran Church. And so I had an experience there for a little while. I then had an experience in a couple of years experience with a wonderful ELCA Lutheran Church, which is a different Lutheran tradition. So throughout that, and then I went to a Lutheran seminary. So my background, I can kind of like speak the language and understand a lot of evangelical background. But my most of my time spent since I was 12 or 13 has been in mainline circles. So that's kind of my faith background. In terms of my gender background and my personal experiences, let me think. So I was assigned female at birth, and so everybody thought I was a girl for the first 20 some years of my life. I came out as bisexual when I was in high school. That was the first thing that I realized about myself. And so I went through a coming out experience as a teenager. And kind of thought, okay, I've got it all together now. Like I figured this out all about myself, only to find as a young adult that actually I had not even begun to touch gender as part of my identity and what that meant. So I ended up coming out as trans as a young adult as I was going through my seminary career. And since then, since coming out, since finishing seminary, I've really been focused on supporting transgender and gender expansive Christians so that they feel like they can live out both who they are and their faith as part of who they are and not have to compartmentalize themselves into little boxes. Yeah. So that's a lot about what my work is today.
Yeah, thank you. How do you mind if I ask, how long ago was that? And what was the kind of the cultural temperature in your seminary? And I guess I'm also thinking comparatively to now, because times are changing, things are shifting, all sorts of crazy stuff is happening. I'm kind of curious what your experience was at a seminary back at that time.
Yeah, well, the seminary that I went to was not and is not still officially LGBT affirming. I went there as an out bisexual person because it felt my choice at the end when I was applying to seminaries was I was either going to go to a seminary here in Minnesota where I live, or I was going to go to one out in California that's a lot more progressive and had a lot more people doing like queer theology work. And I was trying to choose between those two. And I decided to go to the school that was not fully affirming, but was in my tradition because I wanted to learn how to have conversations about things that people disagree about. And so I knew that if I kind of jumped into the deep end at the school that I went into, I would sure learn how to do it. And by gosh, I did. And that was not always a pleasant experience.
Well, you
Yeah.
say your degree is in Old Testament and Hebrew Bible, but it sounds like
Yes.
you've also got another degree in cross-cultural understanding, difficult conversations, I'm presuming as well. So, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. So that. And I didn't end up coming out as trans officially to the school until after I graduated, because I wasn't sure they'd let me graduate. They had not had an out trans person graduate yet.
Yeah.
And so it was a stressful time of life for sure.
But you did graduate.
Mhm.
They let you, quote unquote, let you graduate.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
They graduated. They handed my diploma. And then I came back a week later and said, can I get a different name on this diploma? So it
Did
was
did they
a little bit of a
did they?
uh, they did. The funny thing about, and I think this is probably true at a lot of maybe religious institutions sometimes, is that the staff of the institution were a lot more affirming than a lot of the faculty,
Yeah, yeah.
which is kind of an interesting tension that happens, I think, in a lot of places.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. That's really, really wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's jump right into some definitions. And you do this in your book really, really well. Actually, before we get there, one of the things that I just, I don't know, just really was drawn to, the introduction of your book is really wonderful because it starts off with this question that's very heartbreaking. Did God make a mistake? And that's really, I don't know, to me, it kind of betrays already a problem that we have. Like if something is happening in our identities and in our journey, and we have been told that there's a mistake, and that we like that's one of the fundamental things that we have to wrestle with. That feels to me like we're already doing something wrong. So what we're going to try to do is course correct as best as we can through this level of education. That's again some of my agenda, so that I'm outing myself as what I want to do here.
Outing yourself as having an agenda.
Yeah, I have. Well, let me just confess. I have a bias. I have an agenda. So let me just confess that, and hopefully we'll try to find some, for those who disagree with all this, we'll find some commonality. Let's start with the basics then, because I did ask a question in my script to you about transgender sexuality, and you replied appropriately. Let's just start with what is a definition of gender and sex, because with so much out there, it feels like those are conflated and they need to be more clearly defined. So let's, again, 101, let's define sex, let's define gender, upon which then we can build definitions and understandings of these other terms.
Yeah. So I think, well, I'll say two things. One, the new edition of Transforming that just came out this past spring has a rewritten chapter on gender terminology that brings in a lot of sort of new understandings of gender that have come about even in the last 5 years. So if you're reading the last version versus the new version, there are going to be things that are different, which is good, because when we learn new information, we should be able to integrate that and change, and not decide we don't like the new information and we're never going to change. Right. So
everybody go get the updated version.
Go get the updated version. Yes. So in terms of language and how we talk about this, there are different frameworks in how we understand gender. One framework is to say that there is sex, which is your internal and external biological organs that have to do with reproduction, right? And the ways that we produce and receive hormones and the way that affects our body. And that's all put into the basket of sex, right? And then on the other hand, we have gender, which is sort of the psychological and sociological ways that we understand what it is to be masculine, feminine, male, female, both or neither, like all of that has to do with the psychological and sociological aspects. So in one framework, you split those into two and you go, there's sex and there's gender, and there's two different things. Within another framework, and that first framework is how I set things up in the first edition of Transforming. Within a second framework that I find helpful for my own understanding and I find helpful in teaching, we set it up as a tripart structure, and we talk about how gender is biopsychosocial. So we talk about the fact that there's biological aspects, there's psychological aspects, and there's sociological aspects, and they all work and inform each other. And so there's lots of different ways that you can talk about how gender works, but the basic thing to remember is that our bodies, in terms of like our reproductive organs and our response to hormones, does not determine who we understand ourselves to be 100% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the main thing. So I can kind of draw those out as basics. The other thing I would say is that we need to remember to separate the idea of sexuality in terms of who we are attracted to from gender, because they're different things. We may be, of course, attracted to people of specific genders, right? But who you want to sleep with, for instance, is different than who you understand yourself to be in the context of gender. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes people can get confused and they'll say like, well, isn't being trans, isn't that just gay 2.0? Is that just like more gay? And it's like, no, being gay is about who you're attracted to. Being trans is about how you understand your own experience of gender. So that's why we kind of have to make some explanations around how those two things are different.
Right. In some ways, I'm hearing you make some concessions to the complication, like the very clear separation of sex and gender is criticized sometimes because there is, let's recognize a biological, physiological component. Is that what you're saying? Like, let's recognize that that is true, that gender is, like, for you to say biosocial and psychological is to recognize that biology does play a part, right?
Right. I mean, biology does. I mean, like, so this is the thing, right? If we think about, like, if we split it up into sort of sex is what your body has or does, and gender is how your brain works. Well, your brain is in your body and is affected by things like hormone levels, right? So anytime we try to, for me, it rings very true to when we try to separate body and spirit, right? We try to say those two things are totally separate when it's like, we are much more integrated beings than anybody wants to actually admit.
Yeah, right.
So,
right.
Yeah, there's definitely biological aspects to it. And how we understand those things changes how those things can act sometimes.
Right. And this is the part that we're going to have to parse out very carefully. The mere fact or concession, or however we want to phrase it, that there is biology should not be weaponized to say that, well, see, biology is therefore determinative, right? That's the thing that we have to parse out very, very carefully. We can recognize that there are these components of ourselves, our integrated selves, without absolutizing them and using them as cultural cudgels against different peoples who have these. Okay, so there's a couple questions that came up when you were mentioning that. Number one, there is a list of letters, the LGBTQIA+, etc., and it has felt for some period of time that the T is distinctly different because of this, right? Because LGB is much more about sexual orientation, and the T is much more specifically about sexual identity. Is that a fair assessment? And has that also been kind of influential in the conversation that, there's much more acceptance, I suppose? I mean, if you take a look at some of the American polls specifically, acceptance of sexual orientation has just dramatically shifted. But yet we find ourselves in a cultural moment, I suppose, where transgender identity, and again, I'll say the word, recognizing it's ignorant, transgenderism is a term that's being thrown around. Is that a fair assessment? And what would be your perspective on throwing all of the letters together, I suppose?
I mean, I think the complicating factor we're running into is the how do I want to frame it? Like almost like a cultural short-term memory loss, because for a long time, up through the 80s and into the 90s, there was not as much of a divide or a requirement that you sort yourself into either maybe being gay or being trans or to like to be sorted in that way. There's a really interesting book called Imagining Transgender, and it's an ethnography, and I'm trying to remember the name of the author. I can maybe get it to you later, but it's a fascinating ethnography of a gay man working in New York in the late 90s, early 2000s, interviewing people about their experiences. And he was talking about how, as a person who was working in a nonprofit that was supposed to be helping people access, safe housing and safe sex and things like that, he was required to record people when he met them as either gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender for the organization's sort of structure, right? For them to kind of put out reports and whatever. But what he found was that when he actually met people on the street, they weren't identifying themselves with these same words that he was supposed to be using. And there wasn't a separation in the community. People just were kind of like, well, I'm queer or I'm gay, and that can mean something about my gender, and sometimes it doesn't. So it was a lot more wibbly wobbly throughout the 90s and then through the early 2000s. Now, as LGBTQ plus people have become more seen and known in the media, there has been this sort of separation where we've kind of said, well, you have to pick one. You have to be one thing. Forgetting for the minute that there are trans people who are gay and there are trans people who are straight. And like, there's like so much overlap. And so anytime I see somebody trying to say like we need to isolate out trans folks and like drop the T, quote unquote, from the community, it just makes me think of how that is such a recent thing that we've tried to like put everybody in little boxes, even within our own community. And it doesn't serve us very well, I don't think. So I think people need to understand like the differences between sexuality and gender, but I also think we need to recognize that we are more closely related than we are far apart.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of this push, especially from organizations like the Human Rights Coalition, for marriage equality, where they were like, you know what, we're going to focus just on gay and lesbian folks and kind of forget everybody else because it's not useful for us in marketing right now. And now we're having blowback from that, where trans people are really the focus of a lot of ire because we were allowed to be made to sort of wait our turn for rights.
Yeah. Imagining Transgender, an Ethnography of a Category by David Valentine.
That's the one.
Okay. I think I can add this comment here. I'm going to add this comment into the conversation right now, and as well as the link. It's Duke University Press here, so people can.
It's a fascinating look into like what did it look like to be a trans or queer person before the advent of the internet, and how did we talk about ourselves? It's really fascinating.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, so you're getting to one of the things that you write. By the way, you mentioned this and again, I only have, my apologies, I have not yet gotten onto the bandwagon of the updated edition. I feel actually very, very inadequate right now. I should have done that before the conversation. No, it's my own personal issue. I feel like I want to be really up to speed on things. But you mentioned in your book, it was very early, page 2. Some people have culturally specific gender categories such as Two-Spirit, the Fa'afine from Samoa, the Hijra from India, and others. So this is something it's fascinating because my trip was to Samoa. So I talked to a friend of mine and we had this wonderful conversation about it. So that was really helpful. You also mention an underlying philosophy that is part of the cultural contention, which is gender essentialism. What is gender essentialism? And then it feels like you're hinting to that. And what would be your response and or perspective?
Yeah, I mean, gender essentialism, one sort of definition is that people who hold to a gender essentialist view believe that there is something inherent about men that makes them men in a sort of like, what's the best way to say it? In a sort of almost like spiritual way. And the same thing goes for women, and they are diametrically opposed. And you must always kind of only fall within one of those two boxes. And so when you are hearing from somebody who holds a gender essentialist sort of perspective, you will hear a lot of things about like, well, men are big and strong and made to be protectors and hunters, and women are meant to be kind of subordinate and gentle and loving. And that's like part of the essential essence of what men and women are. So that's one thing that you might come across.
Okay. Let's talk about the terms binary and what that, it's very much connected to gender essentialism. And I want to ask you a question. For the last however long I've been doing some of my own processing, I've come to understand bimodality as a term that more accurately describes what it is. In other words, that there are two dimensions fundamentally, whereas binary means that there are two absolute categories that people fit in, very much like the gender essentialism definition that you mentioned. I'm kind of curious what you think about that terminology. Have you heard it being used? Is that something that is viable and reasonable and or acceptable to use the term bimodality, to recognize, I suppose, that gender, sex is bimodal, that there, for example, you'll hear this a lot in the conversation, there is no such thing as a third gender. So I've been using bimodality. So help me understand, is that appropriate? Is that acceptable? What would be your understanding of that take?
I think it sounds to me, and so I haven't heard it other than just you bringing it up. So I'll say that first. It sounds to me like a movement. There was kind of a movement, and continues to be a movement away from this idea of a two-box system to more of a spectrum, right? To more of this idea that there's like a spectrum along which one can fall when it comes to gender. Whether you see that as a mix of things, an overlap of two things, like however you see that, right? And so it's interesting to see how people try to sort of chart or graph gender and how gender works, because you can see a movement from two boxes to a line along which someone might fall to more of a chart, like an XY axis that you could like chart somebody along, to any of the charts that we sort of like use to think about how gender works fall short in some way or another. There is, at least to my knowledge at this point, no perfect way of explaining how gender works, because everything has to leave out some important piece. So I have yet to come across a perfect way of explaining this. But I would argue that I think bimodal would not work for me in using it to explain gender, because it still relies on this idea of two as a base. And in my experience, in my understanding, in my learning, in my relationships with other people, I really don't think a base two system is ever going to fully encapsulate gender as we know it.
Yeah, that's very much commensurate with what you mentioned too on page 53. To say that you're non-binary innately suggests that there is a binary. And my whole point is that there is no such thing. We've created this formula and forced our understanding of gender into it, which is fascinating to take that understanding and push it forward into the terminology that we use and the labels that we use. And I mean, what is your, I don't know. Do you encourage people to no longer even use the term non-binary as a result of this kind of philosophy and perspective? Or do we still leave it up, however people want to self-identify too, right?
Right. Well, so the first thing I'll say is that quote is actually not mine. It's from M. Jade Kaiser, who used to be M. Barclay, who I interviewed for the book. And so M is talking about how they identify as non-binary, but also see it as a problematic term at the same time. And I think a lot of non-binary folks feel that way. Not all, of course, but a lot of non-binary folks feel that way, where they're like, this is the word that culture has now learned to use, and so I will use it to help them understand that I'm not male or female. But it doesn't actually, it's not the perfect word. It's just the current most used word. And so I use it so that people understand something, but they're not really getting it. So I'm not in any way arguing that we shouldn't use the word non-binary. I think what we've come to use it for is to use non-binary itself as an umbrella term to say any identity that is not male or female. And I think a lot of non-binary folks, I say this because they identify as non-binary folks that I work with, are now moving towards saying, you know what, non-binary works in a pinch, but it's not the perfect word because it's using that reference to a system that doesn't actually help. So I heard one person compare it this way. They said, yes, we use the phrase person of color, right? And person of color can be helpful in certain categories or in certain places and contexts when we are talking about, for instance, how whiteness works and how people of color will experience that. But a Korean American person and an African American person and a Peruvian American person are going to have different experiences. And so saying person of color is only like the second best option, right? Ideally, you would have the exact word for what they are. And so I think we're going to see a similar thing happening as more gender language comes about into the public eye, where we're going to go, yeah, non-binary works, but it's not as good as saying what the person actually is.
That is incredibly helpful and insightful. And I think I'm so grateful for your explanation that this is very much in line with other thinking that we've been doing for quite some time. Our language is just inadequate, and it fails to really, fully represent reality and truth in that sense. So, yeah, thank you for that. That's really, I mean, these are the terms we got to use, as you mentioned.
Right. We're stuck with them, and we're also creating new language. But the frustrating thing is that as we create new language, that new language then becomes prescriptive, and then we fit people into that new language and try to shoehorn them into the new language. So the problem, I think, is often the shoehorning. It's not necessarily the fact that our language isn't perfect. It's that we come up with new language, and for a minute it's bright and shiny and new, and then we start shoving people into it and we don't fit.
I heard a biblical scholar once say that language or terms are kind of like children. You raise them up as your beloved. You send them off into the world, and they come home completely different from the way that you raised them. And they bring a whole bunch of, very shady friends with them. So
it's
I thought that was a really good kind of analogy. Let's shift to faith and religion. All of that was fantastic, by the way. Thank you for helping us. And I know we're skipping over so much, and that's just what we got to do in an
there's
hour.
only so much you can do in an hour.
But I kind of wanted to get kind of some high level stuff, because one of the things, the subtitle of the book, The Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians. So I'm just going to get right to it. A predominant Christian voice is going to articulate that God has made us male and female, right? And so what I'd like for you to do in 5 minutes or less, no, I'm just kidding, sum up.
Can I teach a whole course on it? Or?
Yeah, exactly.
No, 5 minutes.
I know you can do far, far better just in this very short time. What is inadequate about that biblical hermeneutic, that spiritual or religious understanding, and help us understand how Christianity, faith in Jesus, has informed your journey, but also our understanding of gender from this religious perspective. And then maybe I'll follow up with the other question that I want to ask you about a specific kind of teaching about ontology, but we can get there later. So can we start with God has made them male and female. This is what the Bible says. And if you're outside of this, then you're clearly missing God's design for humanity. How should we think about this and understand?
I think in any conversation where somebody says, here's the deal, let's talk about it. I think there are multiple inroads into that conversation, multiple ways that you can kind of take a look at what's going and dissect it a little bit. So we could, if somebody says, the Bible says God made them male and female, we could go at it from the context of, talking about what Genesis 1 is, right? This beautiful poem about the origin of everything, and recognize that there are pieces of creation that don't exist in Genesis 1. And yet that doesn't mean that those things are not beloved and that those things aren't good. God, penguins are not mentioned in Genesis 1. That doesn't mean God hates penguins, right? So we can come at it and go, yes, there are things that are left out of Genesis 1 because it's not a biology textbook, right?
I'm sorry, you just blew my mind. There's no penguins in the Bible. I mean, come on.
I know.
It's like,
how could God leave them out? They're adorable.
Fascinating. So there's no cats in the Bible either. So
fascinating.
Yeah.
I did not know that. This is a good tip. So you can go from it like, okay, what do we do with the things that aren't in Genesis 1? What do we say about those things, right? Then we could go from the angle of, do we understand that, or can we understand that perhaps the things that are mentioned in Genesis 1 are naming of spectrums or naming of ranges of things? For instance, when God creates day and night, only day and night are named, but we know that dawn and dusk exist and that they are also good and part of the world, right? And so could we think of male and female in the same way with this biblical concept of merism, referring to a whole by two parts? Can we look at male and female and go, yes, this is two parts of the experience of gender, but they're not the only two parts. They encompass many other ways of being. So that's one way you could go at it. If you want to talk about
can I pause you just there, because I want our audience to catch what you just said, because it's that might be a paradigm shift for many people. So that merism, that's the technical theological term, applies not only to male and female, but it also applies to heavens and earth. And so some scholars would suggest that you will find this merism, these descriptions of two different categories, as an encompassing of the whole. I like to say that a merism is saying the whole enchilada. That's my idiom that would kind of make sense. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I feel like the reading of Genesis 1 needs to have these nuances, and I just really appreciate you bringing that up.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the fact that Genesis 1 is chock full of merisms, land and sea, day and night, earth and heaven, like all of these pairs that are created in Genesis 1 do not mean that anything that exists in between those things is bad. And so we could understand gender in the same way, right? So that's one way that we could go at it. Another way we could go at it is talking about if you are somebody who comes from a perspective where you think, well, everybody is made to be male and female, but because of, for instance, the concept of like the fall, right? However you understand that, that things are different now than they used to be in Eden. And there's a Christian hermeneutic, an understanding that like we are not necessarily meant to return to Eden. We are not meant to recreate Eden, as we are meant to move towards a new Jerusalem. And when we get to this image of a new Jerusalem, that is a place where people of all races, of all languages, of all differences are brought together and not made the same. They are allowed to be different from each other. And so there's a way where we can talk about, like, even if that was the intention at the beginning, Genesis is the beginning of the story and not the end. They're not necessarily the proscriptive models that we all have to fall into. They are the beginning of a story that is going to end in a totally different place. So there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about Genesis 1, what exists in the world, how that matches up with what the Bible says about what the world should look like. So there's a lot of different possible ways you could go with that conversation.
Let's add to that some of the affirming things that are found in the passage, because you spend an entire chapter, the entire chapter, but a good portion of chapter 7 talking about this Isaiah 56 passage with the eunuch. What is that fundamentally about? What does a eunuch have to do with this conversation, Austen?
Yes. Okay. So eunuchs are maybe one of the most highly debated and contentious identities and or groups of people in modern scholarship when it comes to LGBTQ plus identities. Everybody kind of wants to use the eunuchs to make a point, which is a bummer because the truth is, we only, like, eunuchs show up all over the Bible. They're in a whole bunch of different books, especially in the Old Testament. And we don't have a ton of information about the way they lived their lives in Scripture, but we have more extra biblical evidence for who eunuchs were and what they were. And so I will sometimes get into conversations with people who are like, well, eunuchs only meant people who were assigned male at birth who were castrated. And that's all eunuchs could possibly be. And we have really good evidence from a lot of Near Eastern cultures that were living before and around the same time as the people of Israel that that's not true. The context that we use, that we would use the word eunuch, or we would use similar words specifically within the Talmud. There are specific words, Ilonit, for instance, being one of them, where they are people whose bodies do not fit the gendered sort of shapes and formats and uses that we would expect them to.
Mm.
And so it wasn't just one specific kind of person. A eunuch or a saris in the Old Testament actually covers a lot of different types of
Yeah.
people. A lot of it has to do with infertility, but not all of it.
Yeah.
The reason that they're important is because they were people who were seen as outside of the bounds of male and female. They weren't seen as men, they weren't seen as women, they were seen as a different thing. And so we're not interested in them today because a eunuch is exactly like a trans person or anything like that, but because they're an example in the Bible of a group of people who are not really seen as either entirely masculine or entirely feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And they are treated most of the time with distrust and with disdain because of that. And so Isaiah 56, the reason it's an important passage is because it seems to be a moment where God changes the rules, which is the name of that chapter. Because in Deuteronomy 23, there's this prohibition against anybody who is castrated being part of the community of Israel.
Mm.
And in Isaiah 56, there's this reversal moment where God says, actually, the eunuchs are going to have a special blessing, a name. They are going to have acceptance into this community. They will be welcome in my house and within my walls. So there's this moment where it seems like, even though God originally said no eunuchs and the community was like, great, there's this moment where the rules change in Isaiah, or at least attempt to be changed. As far as we know, that was not fully put into place. A welcome for eunuchs in the temple was not fully put into place, although we don't we don't have the evidence that they were allowed to go into the temple in the same way that other people were, but that's part of what plays into the fascination of the story of the eunuch in Acts chapter 8, which is a whole different story.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, the New Testament mentions that in Acts chapter 8, as well as Matthew 19, Jesus reference, right? And I think your discussion of a recognition that the word eunuch actually describes a whole plethora of potential realities is even spoken of by Jesus there. Some are born this way, some were made that way, and some were made themselves that way, right? There's this a whole bunch of difference there. Okay, so I want to... I really want your perspective. A prominent voice out there, a Christian voice, would say, that's fine. We recognize all of that. That doesn't change the fact that your ontology, and this is kind of the idea, that your fundamental ontology is either male or female. The argument would be that whatever it is that you are biologically born with, and to take in all the definitions that we were talking about earlier, that is your ontology, and theologically, you are either male or female. And then all of these other expressions are merely social constructs and or cultural adaptations, however you want to say that. And what's most important is to recognize and accept what your most truest self is. This is a prominent Christian kind of idea that exists out there that gets some headway. And I'd really love to hear, what does that communicate, and how would you respond, and what do you agree with, disagree with, and what do you do with that?
Well, I love your first question being, what does that communicate? Before we even get into like the basis of that theology, what does it communicate to say that to somebody? I think what it communicates is the general feeling, I think, is I know God's mind better than you do. To which I would ask, how do you know?
Wow.
I don't know. It really the problem with having, I think, these conversations where one person who has a marginalized identity, whatever that identity is talking to somebody who doesn't have that marginalized identity, there can never be a conversation of equals in that moment when you talk about the subject of that person's experience, because one person is always coming to it from isn't this an interesting theological thing to think about? Isn't this a fun thought experiment? And the other person is coming to the conversation with, this means a change. I have to change everything about my life. I have to, this is my identity, my being, my acceptance, my healthcare, my ability to have a job, like, can be based on what you think about me. So that can't be a communication of equals in that moment. So when I meet somebody and they say that to me, it's hard because they may have a dog in the fight theologically, but if they're wrong, it's not going to change the way they're going to live their life. I have a dog in the fight because if they think I'm wrong and they have power over me, that's going to change the way I'm able to live my life. So I think it's important when we have these conversations that, like, we recognize that how these communications come across is one person's fun thought experiment is another person's everyday lived experience of oppression. And we have to, like, wrestle with that fact. So that's the answer to the first question. How does it come across?
I appreciate that. Yeah.
The second question, in terms of, like, what do I actually think about the basis of this idea, right? From what I understand of this argument about ontology, that there's something sort of inherent about you spiritually that makes you man or woman, I would ask them what they base that on. Because I think a lot of people, including possibly this person that you're referencing, what they base it on is the idea that when people are made in God's image in Genesis 1, gender is somehow part of what God is imparting in that imago Dei. Right. And if that's the argument that they're using, I would love to know how they came to the belief that gender is part of the imago Dei that is given to us. Because I don't think we have a good answer to, I don't think we have good evidence that that is what imago Dei means. I think I talk about this in the chapter on Genesis, that, like, the image of God has been argued about so much throughout the centuries. It can mean so many things. It can be about God's relationality. It can be about God's creativity. It can be about God's ability to make decisions, right? It can be about so many things. The idea that the image of God means your reproductive organs feels so reductive to me. I just can't imagine believing that, I guess.
Well, what's working on in the background of that is that gender essentialism. That this is like a theological essentialism, right? And I like the word reductivism as well. It reduces whatever that idea is down to down to bits, down to these kinds of things, and it feels very much stripped of the grandeur of all the things that you mentioned about what does it mean to be created in the image of God. So
right, and, like, I wouldn't say to kind of put a pin on that. I wouldn't say that our bodies are not part of the image of God. Right. I definitely think our bodies can be part of the image of God, but I do not think that our reproductive organs are the pinnacle of what that means, and in such a way that it overrides every other part of ourselves. Yeah. Because if God made my reproductive organs, yes, great, but God also made my brain, and my brain happens to know that I'm male. Right. So, like, I think people will sometimes argue that, like, we can't say that the body is wrong, and I'm not saying the body is wrong. I'm saying part of my body is telling me who I am.
Right. Yeah. Again, what you're communicating is just so really wonderfully insightful because we've bifurcated and separated out these different categories so much we are missing the beautiful integration of all these different parts into our identities as well as into our theologies. When you were talking about the answer to the first question, what does it communicate, which I so appreciated, it reminded me of when you talked about minority stress in your book. Where's the quote here? Page 19. If the high rates of suicide and murder for transgender people can be traced to legitimate fears of harassment, discrimination, and rejection, then the obvious solution is to create an environment in which the injured, the worn out, and the hopeless feel safe and loved. And one of the things that's seemingly very frustrating is I know that the vast majority, I'm going to give benefit of the doubt. The vast majority of Christians who posit this kind of gender essentialism, binary idea about gender in theological circles, I think care, right? They want to be loving. They want to be welcoming, right? There's not evil or negative motives. They are doing what they believe to be true. But yet, this theology, as you just articulated, can tell somebody how that they actually aren't accepted, or that they're wrong, or that they have to change things, which adds to this phenomenon that you mentioned, minority stress. Can you share some more insights or perspectives on that? I mean, this is just my observation of the things that you're mentioning here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't want to go so far as to make people think that that like we shouldn't have disagreements and we shouldn't point out when people are wrong. Like,
Right.
disagreement, discomfort, discomfort is different from danger, right? And so
Mm.
like discomfort can be good. We can grow out of discomfort. Danger puts us in fight or flight, and we cannot learn in the moment when we are afraid, right? So we can kind of make a distinction between those two things. Minority stress has to do with that danger. So minority stress is something that if you are a trans or gender expansive person who looks visibly different, you experience minority stress because every time you have to go to the bathroom out in public, you are ready to be either jumped or yelled at or had the police called on you. That is minority stress that lives in your body and changes your being. So if you are somebody who grows up hearing only that transgender people are sinners and going to hell, and you take in all of this toxic theology, your relationship with other people and your relationship with God can be damaged. Your relationship with self can be damaged. So it's like it comes through theology, it comes through fear for physical safety, it comes through the constant fear of can I be fired or can I be kicked out of my house and lose my housing because of who I am? And those things are everyday stressors that build up over time. And we know what chronic stress does to people. It's terrible. And so it's when people point to a high rate of anxiety or depression or suicidality in trans populations, it's so important to point them back to minority stress as the reason for those things.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that they are inherently broken and like, that something about being trans makes you more likely to have any of these things. It's that you're experiencing constant stress. And that has only gone up in the last 5 or 6 years as trans people have become more visible and less safe.
Yeah. So if we can, oh my goodness, let me just say you were correct. There's no way we're going to get through all these questions in an hour. So
I thought not.
I just want to acknowledge your brilliance and insight. As
No.
as
This
best
just
as
you had a lot of good questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that I want to make sure that we cover well, and I recognize that we're going to be we're going to have to fall short a little bit. You're starting to touch on the cultural aspect. So in whatever brief time that we have, and I want to be respectful of your time too, but I want to give some time to this as best as we can. The most recent kind of I don't know what shall we say series of cultural pieces of news legislation. I know that you keep very well in tune with the things that are going on. Not only adds to that minority stress, but is in at least as best as I can understand, based upon just these fundamentally uninformed and or ignorant and or just misunderstood kind of ideas, and these are being advanced. And so rather than getting into a cultural kind of boxing ring to say here's who's right and here's who's wrong, can you help us understand what really is the reality? Because some of what is happening in our cultural conversation is, and especially the utilization and the weaponization of the danger to children that people are talking about regarding gender affirming care and things like that. You sent me a wonderful Scientific American article entitled "What the Science on Gender Affirming Care for Transgender Kids Really Shows." Do you mind sharing a brief summary of your understanding and perspective of not only that article, but kind of the general overlay and landscape of what gender affirming care is and what we should understand, and how, and especially as Christians, people who are really attempting to love people well, how we should navigate those waters, both personally, but also corporately as churches, as congregations, etc. I know that was a huge question, so
It was a huge question.
take it wherever you would like to go.
Yeah. So I think the first thing I'll say is that there is a huge amount of misinformation out there about what gender affirming care is and what it looks like for folks. There are people who have a very vested interest in using trans people as a wedge issue politically.
Right.
And so they are putting out a lot of misinformation that is just absolutely blatantly wrong. So I would really encourage folks that are like curious about what's actually happening to check out some reputable organizations. Like, you know, the Human Rights Campaign is actually doing pretty well these days. They could do better, but they're doing pretty well. But like GLAAD, as a media advocacy organization where they fact check things. So there's a lot of misinformation going around there. And that misinformation preys on people's fear about kids in the same way that it was like the exact same playbook is being used for trans folks as was used against gay and lesbian folks and bisexual folks. This idea of like, we are a danger to children. Like those of us who are, you know, a certain age, I'm 35. And I can remember growing up being told that gay people were a danger to kids. The idea that you couldn't have a teacher in school who was gay because they'd be a danger to kids. I never had an openly gay teacher because of that. So it's the exact same playbook that's being used. And the use of fear mongering around gender affirming care tends to show up in places like, you know, where people say like, well, we don't want kids having surgery, right? And it's like, well, okay, you're right. We don't want kids to have surgery that they can't consent to. Like we all want the best for kids, right? But the problem is that when people say, well, we don't want little kids having surgery, and that's why we're against trans folks, what ends up happening is that one, they create laws that interestingly forbid other kinds of gender affirming care for trans kids, but allow for surgery of intersex kids, because it's okay to do surgery on intersex kids to make them look more quote unquote normal, but it's not okay to do any sort of gender affirming care for trans kids. So there's like a very clear, like you're not walking the talk here when it comes to protecting intersex kids' bodily autonomy in the way that, you know, the idea is that we protect trans kids' bodily autonomy. So that's one thing. A second thing is no little kids are having surgery who are trans. Like that's not a thing. Like intersex kids, yes. And we need to stop that practice so that they can decide about their own bodies. But for trans kids are not having surgery. The earliest things that can happen for trans kids are things like puberty blockers and then maybe hormone replacement therapy as they get into their late teenage years to keep them on track with their peers. And so those are the points at which we might talk about how, you know, hormone blockers work and how hormone replacement therapy works and what's permanent versus what's not permanent, because not everything, not all gender affirming care has permanent effects. So that's the point at which we, you know, have a lot of hoops that kids have to jump through. It's not like, you know, the stuff you'll hear on the media is like, well, this kid went, you know, walked down the street and got gender affirming care the next day after they came out. That's not a thing. There are so many hoops that trans people have to jump through to access gender related care. So I think the first thing we have to remember to do is if you hear something, go, I better fact check that first. Secondly, who's actually being hurt and who's actually being protected, because originally all the legislation was like, well, let's protect people under 18 from having any gender affirming care. And now it's, well, we're not going to allow gender affirming care for adults either. So we have folks in our community, in the TMC community in Florida, who can't access their medication right now because of that. So it's very much a step down a path to not having bodily autonomy at all. And that's something that we're seeing as an overall problem, I think, in this country in terms of bodily autonomy and healthcare.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay, so let's just be clear. What is happening is psychologically based, or psychology, or social transitioning, for example. So
right.
Gender affirming care from a medical perspective can be a social transition. That can be a name change, that can be dress change, and that can also be a cultural change with whatever school or community that they are a part of. And that is considered part of the gender affirming care. Am I correct in that understanding?
Kind of. So
Okay.
Usually what we think of when we think about transitioning in general is we think about there being medical transitioning that have to do with like hormones and surgery and things like that. There's social transitioning that has to do with just like clothing and hair and presentation and voice and things like that. And then there's legal transitioning that has to do with changing your gender marker and name, and if you want to, on legal documents. So those are kind of like the three buckets of transition, right? Usually when we talk about gender affirming care, we mostly just mean the medical side of things, but there has been a bit of a push now to think about gender affirming care as including more of the social aspect, because we recognize how basically if you are, for instance, a kid who's 10 years old and you're going to school, if you are able to present as yourself at school, you have better mental health outcomes. So we've recognized that the social is affecting the medical. And so that's why they started broadening that a little bit.
That's helpful. There's some very prominent voices out there of people who did go through medical transitions and stuff who are very much advocating against these activities. They're very vocal. They're very prominent. How should we think about that? It seems to me, and again, let me just say something, and again, my caveat at the beginning, having a certain level of ignorance and just trying to understand. There's a certain level at which, well, let's just honor and recognize that maybe these people's experience was very, very negative for them, right?
Yeah.
While at the same time, not absolutizing and saying, well, then this is the model for which we should treat all people with gender dysphoria or who are transgender, et cetera. So is that a fair assessment? Is this an appropriate response? Because I feel like you can't have it both ways. Like if you're affirming, you want to dismiss these people as just kind of charlatans or whatever. And if you're non-affirming and you hold them up as the absolute model. So I feel like what I feel is appropriate, because everything's complicated, is to recognize, well, let's just recognize that there's some people who had bad experiences and it was very negative, and they are very regretful for some of the decisions that either they or other people made for them, while at the same time not disparaging the entire, transgender community. Is that a fair assessment? Help me understand and navigate those waters.
No, I'd say that's a fair assessment. I think we never want to I would never tell a person who had a negative experience with any transition related care that they just shouldn't feel that way or whatever. Their experience is their experience and it's real and they're telling me about it, and I would be honored to hear that. I think the thing to keep in mind is that what we have seen so far is that the rates of regret for things like surgery, for trans-related surgery with adults who are the only people getting surgery again, is only about 2%. About a 2% regret rate. And so, of course, that means that 2% of people is still some people, right? There's still going to be people out there who have those experiences. But those people, I think, are being, I don't know, it's too strong to say preyed upon, but they are being used by people who have an agenda that want to highlight them to try to make things bad for other trans folks. Right. So it's just the same as, whenever ex-gay ministries trot out somebody who says, I was gay and I'm no longer gay, and look how this fixed me. And it's like, well, maybe it worked for you, the 2% of people it worked for, So it's not, we can't use that to say this is how it's going to work for everybody else. And when we say that there's a 2% regret rate, that we have to keep in mind that that's up against things like knee replacement surgery that has a 30% regret rate that we have no problem with people doing. So, no offense to anybody who's had a knee replacement and loved it, but there's 30% of you that hate your knee surgery.
That is really fascinating. The contrast and comparison of that is really astonishing, because my father-in-law had knee replacement surgery and was
how do you find it?
Very, he's in the 70%, right?
Great. That's
very
great.
Happy.
I want that.
But I had never thought that knee replacement surgery would be like 30% of people
it's wild.
Are
it's
very
like one of the most
disappointed
regretted surgeries.
Well, I'll be darned. Well, my father is about ready to, so maybe I should, I don't know. We'll let him make his own decision. That's not this conversation.
Let him have his bodily autonomy.
That's exactly right. That's the whole point of this entire conversation. So there's one question that was submitted, and let me see if I can get this up here right here. There was one question. Oh boy. I gotta fix some of this stuff here. That was submitted, and I'll try to read the entire thing here. That had to do with social contagion, and I think it's very much in line with some of this. Is that we can recognize certain phenomena without necessarily, absolutizing it. So the whole question here, let me see if I can read it whole because it didn't come up in the note here. Should you acknowledge that there may be social contagion among teens in regard to transgender and gender diversity, TGD right now, while reinforcing and explaining the reality of individuals with gender dysphoria? So that's one of the pieces, social contagion. Kids are Instagramming all this, and then all of a sudden they have a sense, well, maybe I am that, and that seems to be one of those concerns. Can we recognize that exists while also affirming, and what should we understand and know about that?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that I would say is that the models that have argued the research in the models that have argued that social contagion is a thing for trans folks have not been able to find any good proof that that's the case. So the idea of social contagion is unproven. And it's something that is very much in the zeitgeist because there's a book called Irreversible Damage that came out a couple of years ago that basically brought up this idea of what she called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which was based on like one study that was not repeatable. So the science is telling us that social contagion is not a thing, but we do know that there is a wider number of young people that are coming out as trans or gender expansive in some way. And so this is what I have learned so far, and this matches with my experience working with trans folks, is that it's not that there are more folks who are trans than there used to be, is that the language is more accessible. And once you have the language, you in some ways can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So for me, I did not grow up knowing anything about transgender people. I didn't know that they existed at all. And I figure out the language to explain who I was or how I felt. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I found out like transgender people existed. I learned about like I got the language that I needed. And at that point I was like, oh, I can't ignore this anymore. Now I know it's a thing. And that is really what we're seeing more with young people, is them having access to that language. And so the argument then, of course, from folks that are not happy with this is, well, we can't let our kids know that these people exist. We can't let them get access to this language because then it'll turn them trans, right? It's not ever going to turn somebody trans. It's that the people who need to hear it finally get to hear it and get to know who they are and get to find people like them. And the people for whom it's not relevant, it just sort of rolls off their back because it's not relevant for them. I think it's more of a conversation factor. Gender in general is more of a conversation factor than it's ever been before, because even cisgender folks, even folks that feel very confident about being the gender that they were assigned at birth, feel like it's worthwhile to have conversations about what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. And that's good. Like, it's good for us to have these conversations. So I'm really happy with the fact that this is something we're talking about more. But in terms of seeing it as a social contagion, it just isn't being bared out in the evidence.
Very, very helpful. Okay, Austen, I have taken a lot of your time already. I try to be very respectful. I kind of want to keep going, but I'll bring it to a close here. Let me just sum up. This is helpful for me. The gender binary that so many of us have grown up under is really false. It just doesn't exist biologically, sociologically, etc. These are constructs that we've created. So we have to just be much more thoughtful regarding our gender language that we use. Theologically, religiously, there's a lot more complexity, nuance, and expansiveness in the scriptures, as well as in the Christian tradition, as well as in the identity of people like eunuchs in our tradition. And much of the cultural, unfortunately, as does seem to be with most culture war issues, that there's so much misinformation, misunderstanding, and just falsehoods that are being utilized, leveraged, weaponized, etc., for specific people's agendas. And I really appreciated your kind of analysis that one person's kind of theological views is actually another person's actual life.
Yeah.
and recognizing that is really critical. So that's my brief summary of the conversation to make sure that we really kind of nail home how important everything that you mentioned is. I'd like for
Well,
you to,
thanks.
yeah, it's fantastic, and I so appreciate your work, and I appreciate again the even in this conversation your humility and your honesty, the recognition of the truth of the matter, and getting to that is just so important and critical, and just your personhood, just how you posture yourself is just such a gift, and I really appreciate that.
Well,
This,
thank you.
yeah. This person asked the question: what has been the most beautiful and inspiring thing that you've experienced about God, faith, as you have discovered yourself and advocated for the trans community, which is very much in line with the closing question that I wanted to ask you, which is to speak to somebody, whether or not they are transgender or cisgender, whatever their gender identity might happen to be, who's just starting out on this journey, trying to navigate their way through their philosophy, the cultural piece. And I just wanted you to be a pastor, I suppose, in some particular sense to these folks, which I know you do, right? I know you may not have the title pastor, but you care about people, you
It's
love
what I
people.
ended up doing anyway.
Yeah, it's
I
exactly.
went the academic route thinking I'm never going to be a pastor, and then I end up doing pastoral care anyhow.
That's
That's
right.
God.
That's right. So there's the final question there for you, and to give some exhortations, encouragements, and or advice to people who are just starting out on this journey.
Yeah, I think the most beautiful thing that I've experienced about God is allowing for so much more mystery in all of this. They're living within a faith that professes that there's this like magical thing called the Trinity, where it's not three and it's not one, but it's both. And yet that same faith, we have people coming from it and going, well, it has to be one thing or the other. It has to be male or female. And I'm like, well, can't there be a little bit of mystery there? I think the most beautiful thing is leaning into the mystery, leaning into the both and that shows up a lot of times in my Lutheran background. So yeah, I think being trans and being in trans community allows for a lot more questioning and a lot more beautiful mystery. So yeah, I appreciate that. In terms of what I would say to folks who are first kind of coming along in this journey and learning about themselves, I would say, I would say I almost wrote my graduate thesis on the Hebrew phrase al tira, which means fear not. It's what the angels always say when they show up. I would say fear not, because so much of these conversations can feel scary when you're having them. Even asking deep questions and doubting things can feel really scary. Asking questions about like, well, how do I know that I'm a man or a woman? Like that can feel like a scary question to ask because you don't know what's going to be on the other side of it. And so fear not, because there is going to be stuff on the other side of it. And asking these questions is going to lead you to some beautiful conversations and beautiful relationships that you might not have if you just assume that you know everything from the get-go.
Brilliant. Austen, thank you so much. Founder and director of the Transmission Ministry Collective and author of the 10-year-old book, Transforming. Make sure you get the new and updated March 2023 edition of the book.
And let me plug as well, if you go to transmissionministry.com, which is TMC's website, we have resource pages there as well. So if you're like, I would love to find more books about being trans and being Christian for family members or for pastors or for trans people themselves, transmissionministry.com is where we have those resource lists.
There it is. I can't thank you enough. We've just met today, but I, like I said, 4 years ago, was just so struck. And you were kind of the first entree for me of really starting to rethink and to understand. So I owe you a debt in that particular sense. I was in that audience and I just am so grateful. And again, not just your information, but the posture and how you go about these conversations and helping all of us to understand better. And the ultimate goal to provide life. I mean, this is one of the most fundamental principles, to love God and to love people to embrace life. The Deuteronomy commission at the end, I have set before you both life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life. And you are helping us through your work and your ministry to choose life for all of us. And for those of us who are cisgender and don't have the same experience, I hope more of us can enter into a humble posture of listening and learning from folks like yourself, so that we can be better advocates and allies for advancing that kind of life in the world. And I think this conversation definitely helped a lot of us do that. So Austen, thank you so much. And I won't take up any more of your time. And I so appreciate you, and blessings to you and the entire trans ministry collective community.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, Kevin.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. Oh, they're coming in. Allison, thank you so much.
Aw.
Thank you, Austen. Patty says, awesome conversation. I love my people. They're amazing people. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks for watching.
And join us next week as we talk about philosophy with children. So that's going to be next week's conversation. Have a good night, everybody.